Chapter 7. Accosted. As Jacen stepped out of the tavern the next morning, he was suddenly surrounded by many of the villagers as someone shouted, "There he is!" The bullies, Breckle, Court, and Journal were present and pushed their way closer to Jacen in the throng of people that had gathered. A large purple bruise could be seen on Court's neck, and Journal wore a plain-colored windana around his eyes. Breckle wore a bandage around his head, and a large knot was seen pressing against the cloth where he had been struck the night before. He shouted above the hum of the onlookers, "This is the one who did it! This is the sorcerer who made the wind scream and blinded Journal!" Breckle's father was known as the chief elder of the village and was a man who had major influence with the rest of the village council. He was a tall and well-built man who wore an expensive weave of cloth that was exported from a major city village. The tall man stepped forward and said to Jacen, "Is this true? Did you perform magics in front of my boy last night?" Jacen looked around at the distrustful faces of the villagers looking at him and decided to make his leave. Bowing his head and speaking in measured, quiet tones, he began backing away from the throng of villagers in the direction of a nearby alley, when Breckle screamed out, "Somebody grab him! All sorcerers are to be burned alive by the order of the Dark Lord!" Assenting murmurs could be heard amongst the crowd as several men began making their way to block Jacen's path. Just then, a loud feminine voice shouted, "Stop at once!" The spell of the angry crowd was momentarily broken by the sound of the voice. Janae and Benny strode forward into the throng. Benny was carrying fresh rabbit meat from a recent hunt, and Janae was carrying her longbow and quiver of arrows slung over one shoulder. The young huntress wore hunting trews and a form-fitting tunic that accented her athletic form. She was a stunning vision of natural beauty in the morning light, with a sheen of moisture just covering her face from her recent hunt in the forest. She addressed the mob. "This single man defended my Benny from Breckle and his thugs last night," shouted Janae. This was followed by several laughs at Breckle's expense. Bright red with embarrassment, Breck suddenly screamed in rage and ran at Janae. Right at the last moment before running into her, Janae twisted to the side and caught one of his feet as he ran by. This action tripped him onto the muddy ground where he landed face first into the mud. This was met with roars of laughter, which halted the moment Breck stood up and pulled out a knife. Breckle's father shouted, "Son, stop this immediately!" The gleam of the blade of the knife could be seen by everyone as Breck stabbed out towards Janae. Just then, Jacen appeared behind Breckle and deftly struck him in the right shoulder. Breck screamed and grabbed his arm, and the knife fell out of his hand as the nerves to his arm were momentarily paralyzed. The crowd took on a hostile tone, and angry murmurs could be heard as the group closed in around Jacen. "Take him into custody!" shouted Breckle's father. As several of the stout village men began moving towards Jacen, the temperature in the center of the square noticeably dropped, and plumes of moisture could be seen exiting each person's mouth and nose as they breathed. A building growl was heard coming from Jacen, who was slowly tensing to attack the group of men moving towards him. The intensity of the sound was such that any immediate bystanders near him were repelled by the vibration of his growling and moved away. While the bystanders moved away, Jacen pulled out his staff from its holder on his travel pack, uttered an arcane word, and struck the ground in front of him, causing a loud impact of air to push outward from him in a circle. The loud noise from this action caused several people to cry out, and Jacen noticed Janae and others staring at him in a peculiar way. Breckle's father seemed to come to a decision. With moisture billowing from his mouth, the tall village leader said to Jacen, "You are a witch. As chief elder, I demand you leave this village and never return." The man then said to the villagers, "Men, go get your spears and bows to escort this witch out of our village." Several others cried out their agreement, and the shivering village men pulled out knives and makeshift weapons as others ran to find bows and spears. The elder turned and said to Janae, "No one in the village will trade with you anymore. You get out too, and be certain to take that simpleton with you." With a glare on her face and a plume of moisture exiting her nostrils, Janae spat on the ground, turned on her heel, and walked back in the direction of the poor cabin she shared with Benny. Jacen left soon after, and none of the bystanders followed, letting the moment of tension finally come to an end. The temperature returned to normal after a brief time had passed, and the villagers went about their business, murmuring to each other in an uneasy way. Janae and Benny were quiet on the walk back toward the cabin. Jacen caught up to her and gently said, "I'm sorry to have created trouble for you and Benny. What will you do?" "I can always hunt for food while we figure things out," Janae said quietly in response. "May I travel with you both a while longer? "I've not had too many friends," he said in a quiet tone. Janae stopped and looked at him in the eyes, while Benny meandered on ahead and was whistling back at the birds in the trees. After a long look at his eyes, she sighed and asked him, "Are you a sorcerer?" Jacen looked back at her and after a moment quietly answered, "Yes." Janae held his gaze a moment, then said, "If you helped Benny, then you can't be all bad. So yes, you can come with us while we figure out what to do." She took his hand in hers and squeezed it reassuringly. Jacen felt a lump of emotion form in his throat at the acceptance from this beautiful girl, who he had fervently hoped would become his friend. Just then, Benny cried out, and they all looked up to see black streams of smoke coming up from their burning cabin at the end of the main path. The dilapidated shack was quickly consumed with the flames, and the goats in the attached paddock bellowed with fright. Janae cried, "Oh no!" and ran to help the screaming goats, while Jacen ran over to the cabin and began to beat at the nearest flames with his travel cloak. After another moment, the burning roof collapsed in on itself. Just then, the bully Fennec was seen to be running up the path toward the main village and was laughing as he looked back in their direction. Janae furiously picked up her bow and loaded an arrow when Jacen called out, "Wait!" Janae took aim at the fleeing figure. She released the arrow, sure it would meet its mark, when suddenly the arrow was knocked out of its flight path by a stone that had apparently been thrown by Jacen. The broken arrow landed on the ground as the bully ran away from the burning cabin. In her fury, Janae turned to Jacen and shouted, "Why did you do that?" With a gentle expression, Jacen calmly replied over the roar of the growing flames, "You would likely regret it if you had harmed him, as the villagers would be sure to have their vengeance upon you or Benny." Still breathing heavily in anger, she looked over at Benny, who was watching the cabin burn, and called out, "Benny, grab the barrow and camp supplies from the storage shed before it catches on fire." Benny moved off to follow her orders. Calming down, Janae looked back at Jacen and said, "Come on, let's see if there's anything to salvage from this burnt wreckage." After several minutes of carefully scouring through the burnt remains, the group found what supplies they could carry with them and began to make their way just beyond the edge of the forest. The goats had been carefully picketed and were now leashed to the barrow of supplies. The group walked for most of the rest of the day, with Jacen dragging the barrow until finally twilight came upon them. Exhausted and tired, the group found a sheltered screen of trees near their path and set up camp for the night. The goats were tied to a nearby sapling and allowed to graze on the vegetation that grew upon the forest floor. They soon had the meat from Janae's earlier hunt roasting over a campfire and were eating their fill after a long and emotional day. "Where we go now, Auntie?" Benny asked, with meat and juices running down his face. His broad face was still dirty from the soot of the burned cabin. After a few moments, Janae got up and walked over to the boy. Taking a canteen of water and pouring it on a relatively clean cloth, she began cleaning his face. The boy grinned at her as she cleaned him, and she answered, "We'll go to a larger town and look for work. We can camp in the forest or set up in one of their taverns." "There's often work in Maronia at this time of year. Perhaps that is a good option for us to pursue," offered Jacen. Janae agreed, and soon everyone was content after the dinner. Benny soon fell asleep on a bundle of rescued blankets as Janae and Jacen quietly visited in a friendly manner deep into the evening. Eventually, Janae began yawning, and Jacen offered to watch the camp while she caught some sleep. Benny snored loudly on his sleeping mat and passed gas in his sleep, which made Jacen and Janae grin at each other. The young girl spread out some blankets upon the ground near Benny and lay down. Soon, her breathing deepened, and she fell into a restful sleep. Jacen took the opportunity to run through his nightly stretching and meditation routine. Finishing his nightly practice, he sat with his back against a stone, trying not to look at the flames of the fire as it died down to embers. As the glowing embers lay still in the deep hours of the night and the others slept, Jacen sat in quiet meditation, lost in the quiet nighttime sounds of the forest. As always, the whispers murmured in the background in their language and subtle offerings, sometimes with the ill-sounding laughter that was associated with their kind. Jacen ignored the whispers and dozed, not entirely falling asleep. Late into the evening, Benny began moaning in his sleep and saying words in a strange language. Jacen roused himself and stood up and walked over to the boy, where he kneeled and placed his hand on Benny's forehead. He whispered in an unknown arcane language, bringing a light breeze and a coolness to his touch upon Benny's hot brow. Suddenly, Benny opened his eyes wide and looked at Jacen's own and whispered, "Magnus!" Then Benny closed his eyes and instantly fell back asleep, apparently untroubled any further. Jacen covered Benny up and checked on Janae, who had not stirred during the strange exchange. Wondering at the strange word Benny had uttered, he sat back down to set watch over the camp. He could not settle his mind. A subtle irritation began to grow in the back of his mind at his inability to shake the feeling of unease. The young man unconsciously reached up to scratch at the birthmark beneath his left eye as the 3/4 moon rose high into the night sky.